Hi, everybody. Hi, thanks for coming. For anybody that doesn't know me, I'm Joanne Levy, and with me is Tziporah Cohen, and we're going to just start with bios so that you get to know us. So I'm going to start by introducing Tziporah. Tziporah Cohen was born and raised in New York, spent 18 years in Boston after college, and then landed in Toronto, Canada, where she lives with her husband, 3 kids, 2 cats, and 1 dog. Her debut novel, No Vacancy, won a Sidney Taylor Honor, was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, and was recently shortlisted for the Canadian Children's Book Centre inaugural Jean Little First Novel Award. It has also been nominated for the Hackpatack Children's Choice Award and Saskatchewan's Diamond Willow Reader's Choice Award, and most recently, the Ontario Forest of Reading's Reader's Choice Award in the Silver Birch category. In addition to writing, Tziporah is a psychiatrist specializing in oncology and palliative care, where she deals regularly with grief and bereavement.
Thank you. Now I get to introduce you. Joanne Levy's love of books began at a very early age. Raised by voracious readers, one of her favorite childhood memories is of the weekly trips to the bookstore with her mom. Joanne can usually be found at her computer, either creating spreadsheets, sometimes just for fun, or channeling her younger self into books. She lives in rural Ontario, Canada, with her husband and kids of the furred and feathered variety. Joanne's debut, Small, Medium at Large, isn't that the best title? Was an MYRC Award honor book and a Sidney Taylor notable book. Her book, Fish Out of Water, is also a Diamond Willow nominee up against No Vacancy. The book we're talking about today, sorry for your loss, received a star from Kirkus Reviews, and I can personally tell you that those are very hard to come by.
Thank you. And before we get into the reading and the Q&A, we'd just like to do a brief land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that the land I am broadcasting from today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. I recognize the First Peoples' continued stewardship of the land and water, and that this territory was subject to the dish with one spoon wampum under which multiple nations agreed to care for the land and resources by the Great Lakes in peace.
And as a resident of Toronto, I acknowledge that I am living on and speaking to you from Indigenous land. The land I reside on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit.
And we'd also like to remind and reaffirm as Canadians our accountability to these Indigenous nations and to all Indigenous peoples and communities.
So, schedule for the event, Joanne is going to do a reading to start us off and get us into the book. Then we'll have a Q&A period. I'll be asking her some questions, as well as possibly, if time permits, some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. Then Joanne will do another reading, and then we will take questions from all of you guys. If you could please put your questions in the Q&A. If you see the bottom bar, the Q&A to the left of the chat button, that way I can find them. It's too hard to find them as they go flying through the chat. So please put your questions in the Q&A. I believe that you can upvote. So if you have the same question as somebody else, use that function, and then we'll know which are the most popular questions, and hopefully we'll get to answer all of them. So Joanne, take it away.
Thank you so much. And so I'm going to start reading Sorry for Your Loss. There is a prologue, but I'm going to skip it for today and start in with chapter 1. I am not obsessed with death, but it's a bit hard to avoid thinking about death when your family owns a funeral home and everyone works there, including me. My part-time job at the Walman Memorial Chapel, my family's last name is Walman, includes cleaning and stocking the bathroom with paper towels and toilet paper. I'm also in charge of making sure there are always plenty of tissues for the mourners. Dad calls me purveyor of paper products. I call him His Royal Highness of Dad Jokes. But right now I was thinking about a totally different kind of paper. I had just loaded up on craft supplies at my favorite stationery store. I can't wait to get started on my projects, I said to Susanna, the owner, as she slid all my purchases into a bag. I bounced from one foot to the other. I was pretty excited about the vellum I had found. It was so delicate, almost see-through. I'd also gotten some heavy cardstock with pretty deckled edges and some fancy handmade papyrus. I guess you could say I am obsessed with paper. This was all because of Sam showing me, excuse me, how to quill last summer. I couldn't help but think how much he would have liked what I'd bought today. He'd especially like the delicate papers like vellum, which was maybe why I'd bought it, even though it could be incredibly hard to quill with. I'm looking forward to seeing them when you're done, Susanna said with a smile, handing me the bag. You're getting so good. I love sharing my quilling projects with Susanna because she's always so enthusiastic. And she was right. I really was getting good. Can you let me know when the foil comes in? I asked. I have an idea for... Just then, the big church bells outside bonged, announcing that it was 2:00. Shoot, I was supposed to be home by 2. The bells hadn't even stopped bonging when I got a text from Mom. Where are you? Uh-oh. My parents had wanted to send me back to summer camp like usual. They're always so busy at the funeral home, and they worried that once school was out, I'd be bored and get in the way. But I told them I didn't want to go this year. I had my reasons. One of them was Sam, though they don't know anything about that. Anyway, I'm happy to work at the funeral home and make some money from my paper and other stuff. Plus, I'm actually interested in learning more about how our family business works. The deal was, if I didn't go to camp, I had to do all my chores, put in my hours at the funeral home, and never, ever complain about being bored. Oh, and I had to promise to be on time for everything. Mom is a real stickler for punctuality, as she likes to remind us all the time. I said a quick goodbye to Susanna and raced out of the store. So fast, in fact, that I nearly took out a couple of people coming in. Whoa, sorry, I blurted. But then I saw who it was. Mary and Sasha. Great. I had been hoping I wouldn't have to see them until September. I muttered an apology I really wasn't feeling and tried to get past them. Nope. They blocked the doorway and just looked at me. I pasted a smile on my face. Oh, hey, how's your summer going? Can you believe we're going into 8th grade? Unbelievable, right? I am. Having a good summer, I mean, even though I'm not going to camp this year. I'm helping out at at home, I guess. What are you two doing? Having fun? Finally, I had to stop to take a breath. Mary and Sasha just kept staring. Sorry, I muttered, even as my face grew hot. I clamped my lips shut. Mary snorted and rolled her eyes. She's awfully chatty for a corpse, isn't she, Sasha? Here we go. Right, Sasha said. I mean, I thought corpses were quiet. I didn't realize they talk nonstop. Do I even need to say it? Mary and Sasha are the worst. Sasha wasn't done either. She laughed at her own clever comment and then leaned in close. She took a loud sniff of my ponytail. And she sure smells like death. Disgusting. You sure you're not a zombie? Evil? After my speech in class about how I was going to be a funeral director when I grew up, the two of them had come up with all kinds of mean nicknames that I am now mostly used to. Sort of. I'd washed my hair that very morning with the shampoo I'd made my mom buy after the last time Sasha said I smelled like rotting corpses. The shampoo is strawberry scented. A part of my brain drifted away and started wondering if dead people smell like strawberries. And if they do, how Sasha would know. I'd never gotten close enough to the actual dead people at the funeral home to sniff them, but the building didn't smell like strawberries or any other type of fruit. I wanted to tell them both to shut up. Also, that like I told them a million times before, my job at the funeral home doesn't include getting close to dead people, so I couldn't smell like one. But for once, I kept my mouth shut. It wouldn't matter. They just didn't care. No matter how hard I tried to show them that I was a normal girl whose family just happened to own a funeral home, they kept picking on me. After my speech, I'd made Dad come to career day to talk about what it was like to be a funeral director and how important a job it was. After all, eventually everyone needs one. I thought that would make things better, but no, it got even worse, way worse. Now everyone at school thinks my whole family is weird and obsessed with death. When you go to a small private school like I do, Everyone knows about everything about you, even the kids in different grades. I'd asked my parents to transfer me from Beit Sefer to a public school with a ton of kids who don't know me, but they said I should try to stick it out for 8th grade. After that, if I was still unhappy, we could talk about my going to a public high school. Until then, I was stuck being known as Chatty Corpse Girl, Morticia, Evil, and whatever other humiliating names they could come up with. "What'd you buy, goth girl?" Sasha said as she and Miri shifted to block my way completely. She reached for the bag in my hands. "Black eyeliner?" I pulled the bag away before she could get it. "This is a stationery store," I said. "They don't sell eyeliner." And it wasn't like I even wore makeup. Duh. "I know that," Sasha barked. "I'm here to pick out my bat mitzvah invitations for my bat mitzvah." I guess she was emphasizing the words to make it sound like a very big deal. "That you won't be invited to, by the way," she added. This was a lie. At our school, when someone has their bar bat mitzvah, they have to invite the whole class. It's only like 12 people, but it's a rule. "Like I'd even want to go," I said. I added a pfft for good measure. All right, so maybe I did sort of want to go, but only to show her and everyone else that I was a good person who didn't hold grudges. I definitely wouldn't have any fun though. Or maybe I would have fun just to show her how much I didn't care that she and Miri were so mean to me. "Whatever," Sasha said, adding a loud cluck of her tongue as she leaned toward me. Miri moaned and rolled her eyes back. "Don't get too close, Sasha. She might try to eat your brain." It was a pretty lousy impression of a brain-eating zombie, if you ask me. "Oh yeah, right," Sasha said, backing up dramatically. I fought back tears as I pushed past the girls. Just because I didn't want any friends didn't mean I was immune to these girls being so horrible. I got on my bike, looping my bag over the right handlebar, and pedaled toward home. The tears poured out of me, but I took some comfort in thinking about how when I grew up and became a funeral director like my parents, I wouldn't have to worry about my clients being mean to me because they'd already be dead. That is chapter 1.
Take a moment to enjoy the thunderous applause.
Oh,
Thank you. I love hearing authors read their own work and hearing how, how it sounds in their head, the original. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
All right, so let's jump into some questions. So your main character, Evie, her parents own a funeral home. And you mentioned in your author's note that your father manages a funeral home. So I was curious how much of this fascinating setting came from experience versus research, and what was the research that you needed to do to get this so accurate in your book?
Yeah, thank you. And great question. So unlike Evie, I didn't grow up in the business. My dad started there back in early 2000s, I think, as a volunteer first. But I've always found the topic of funerals and funeral homes really fascinating. What's that old saying? Everybody someday needs the undertaker. So it's just one of those facts of life that, no matter what religion, denomination, or none, everybody ends up there in the end. But as far as my own research, if you've ever been to UHMC in Hamilton, Ontario, you will recognize it from my book, because I used basically that as a setting so that everything worked out in my head. There's the quiet room and the chapel and where you come in. So I use that very closely as my, research inspiration. So as far as my research, my dad, who's here, hi Dad, was my great resource for how things go and helping me with tours of the funeral home and letting me take pictures for my own research. And he was a great resource for books as well and other resources. And in fact, I should plug that on my website, joannelevy.com, I also have a research page, so you can see some of the photos that I took in my own research. And there's also links to other resources as well. And some of them are just absolutely fascinating. And obviously a book for kids, I can't put everything in for content and, because there would just be 1,000 pages if I did, but it's really interesting. So if you find that sort of thing fascinating like I do, have a look there. But yeah, I tried to be as close to what really happens as I possibly could be. I didn't take a lot of artistic license, just because I wanted it to be factual as well as entertaining.
It's so interesting. I'm actually curious what your father thought about you writing this book.
Oh, maybe he could put something in the chat. I don't know. I don't know
Maybe
if
we'll
he's
put
on
him
his
on at the
phone
end. So, you know what? One of the amazing things about this book, in my opinion, is there are many books about grief for this age group. I mean, Sorry for Your Loss is written for middle grade. Lots of books written about grief, but there are very few books written about death. And I'm making a distinction between those two things. And so I really find, this is a terrible pun, but this is a very groundbreaking book, in my opinion, as a psychiatrist and as an author. And I'm so proud of this book for you, because I think it's so important. You tackle the subject of death with such respect and honesty, curiosity, and lots of humor, which is wonderful. And I'm wondering how it came to you to write about this topic for kids.
Yeah, thank you. So backing up a little, so my first book, called Small, Medium, at Large, which you mentioned, is a book about a girl who got hit by lightning and can then hear ghosts. So there is sort of a death element in that book, but the ghosts are very meddlesome and funny, and it's not a book really about death and grief at all. So I had thought that when I started thinking about wanting to write a book set in a funeral home, I was going to write a companion novel to that. And so I went to the funeral home and toured and did some research. But when it came time to sit down and write the book that I thought would have the same sort of tone as Small, Medium, at Large, things just weren't gelling. And I think the problem at that time was I couldn't reconcile a frothy, fun book with a book would be inevitably about death and grief. And I never wanted to dismiss any feelings of grief and hurt and loss. And I had a feeling that there's always going to be some kids that come to a book like that who have suffered their own grief and loss. So I didn't want to diminish those feelings. So it just didn't work. So I put it on the back burner, and I thought, okay, it's a good concept to have that setting, but it's just not working. And I figured one day I'd get back to it, as often writers do. You put something on the back burner, you come back to it. So back in 2013, when we lost my mom, and we ended up in the back room of the funeral home, the door marked private that most people don't see. And so we were there, my dad and my brothers and myself. And I remember looking around thinking, because I'd been there before to do my research, I felt comforted knowing what would happen to her and what happened in that room. And despite it being just the worst time and terrible, and of course I was deep in grief, I still felt comforted. And I thought, most people don't have access to this, and especially kids. We don't share not only the behind the scenes, but oftentimes we're hiding things about grief and funerals and what happens to our bodies when we die and where they go. And I recognized that kids are curious, kids want to know, and they deserve to know in an age-appropriate, safe, and accessible way what happens. And that was the kernel of the idea of sort of pulling back the curtain on what happens behind the scenes at funeral homes. And it just sort of worked from there.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think it's just so important, the way you approach this, because I think that we try to protect kids from talking about grief and death and dying. I like to call that an error of kindness. But really, they can handle these discussions, and it prepares them. It makes them more resilient for the grief and the loss that they will eventually, experience as they grow older. So somebody said in the chat that this would be It's gone now, but I saw somebody before. Oh no, I'm sorry, it's in the Q&A that the book is ideal to help kids dealing with death. And I think that's really true. But I also think it's good for kids who aren't grieving, because they will eventually be grieving. We will all be grieving somebody and something as we get older. Okay, so I'm switching topics a little. I had to look up quilling when I started reading this book. I had never heard the term before. I didn't know what it was. It's a great word. I love the word quill. It's just a great word, but I had never heard of it. So I looked it up, and it's pretty darn amazing. So in your book, Fish Out of Water, Ari is his name, is he knits. So I'm wondering if you quill or you knit, and what role do crafts play in your life, and how did you decide to use quilling in this book?
Yeah, thanks. So Fish Out of Water, it's Fishel who learns how to knit.
I don't know why I have Ari in my head. I think because Sarah Aronson is here.
So I was a crafty kid, so crafts are definitely on my radar, and I do knit, but not very well. The best I can do for knitting is the dishcloths that Fish talks about in the book, how he doesn't want to knit dishcloths. That's about the extent of my skill. But quilling, it's funny how it came about. And thank you for asking, because this is kind of a fun story. So I've never quilled, and I didn't even know quilling existed either. But when I started writing about Evie and how she stands at the door and gives out packs of tissues, that was always going to be part of this book. But when I was first thinking about how things would come about and drafting it, in my head, she put little notes in the tissues saying, "I'm sorry for your loss," or, just inspirational quotes and things like that, just a little piece of paper. And I don't remember consciously why I didn't do that, but when I started looking up paper and Googling things, and I found quilling. So it was the strips of paper thing that took me to quilling. And I mean, if anybody Googles quilling, it is the most beautiful, amazing art. And I actually have some here because I figured if I'm going to write a book where somebody does quilling, I need to learn how to quill just so I can get inside her head. So I actually bought a quilling kit, and this is how the paper comes when you buy a quilling kit. It's just a strip of paper, and you wrap it and you make little designs and things. And I actually did one here, but it's not very good. So you make little coils and stuff and put them together. And I actually did a craft project that I'm going to share, which is my interpretation of Sorry for Your Loss cover, had I quilled it, hopefully. So I actually did the hearse and all that stuff. So that's my interpretation in quilling. And that is the most quilling I will ever do. I do not enjoy quilling. It is not my craft of choice. I find it fiddly, and you need little fingers to be able to do it right. But I felt like I wanted to do it for that. So that's how I got into paper quilling, and will probably never quill again.
That is very funny. And wow, I love that interpretation of the cover. That's great. Okay, so here's a question, since we have time before we need to start our second reading, that was submitted in advance. Do you have to get sensitivity readers for your book or books? And if yes, where do you find them?
That's a great question. This particular book, my dad was very helpful. He read it a couple times. And I've never sent a book out as much as I did as this one for beta readers. Not a ton of sensitivity reads, because I kind of leaned on my dad for that, to make sure that I got all the processes correct and the names for things, and got that right. But I wanted to make sure for this one that I got everything right and hit the right points with sort of a diverse audience. So I sent it out to a lot of people. In the book that I have coming up, I did send it to sensitivity readers just to make sure I got some of the processes right. It's you want to make sure you get things right. And sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And you don't want to make any errors in that way. So, and how I find them, over the years since I've started writing seriously, I've developed an amazing, amazing group of writers around me. And a lot of times we trade manuscripts, and sometimes it's a matter of finding somebody who specializes in whatever you're writing about that you may not be an expert on. So it's sort of that. And I guess if I had to go outside of that community, I would just find experts. Actually, that's not true. With The Sun Will Come Out, I did find a sensitivity reader who was outside my experience. And in that book, there's a kid who has progeria, which is a terminal disease where kids age prematurely. And I actually sent it to somebody from the Progeria Association, I think it's called, and she did a sensitivity read. So it's a matter of reaching out to experts beyond, like if you need somebody who's beyond just, beta readers. Does that make sense? I hope I answered that properly.
No, I think you answered it perfectly. I'm gonna, just a reminder to everyone, please put your questions in Q&A. If you have put a question into the chat, please retype it into the Q&A because I will not find it in the chat. But so pulling one from the Q&A before we do the second reading, Anita Yasuda asks, could you describe how you got your character Evie's voice just right? And we got such a great taste of that voice in that first chapter.
Thank you. I channel my inner 12-year-old. And so I don't know. I have what in my head is, I call it my bossy tween voice, where the character knows everything, but doesn't know everything, and is sort of brash, but insecure at the same time. I'm not sure how to explain it other than that, but it's channeling me at that age. And maybe my maturity level is a bit stunted, and that helps. So yeah, that's basically it. So Evie in this book, she's a little different for me. A lot of my characters have one element of me, or are more like me or less like me. Evie is just a chatter. She's a chatterbox. She talks and talks and talks. And that's, other than me rambling right now, that's not my natural thing. So I had a lot of fun with her, making her say everything that I might be thinking, but without the filter. So everything she thinks just falls out of her mouth. And she's a nervous talker. So that just made her lots of fun. So yeah, that's how I created Evie.
Yeah, she's great. She really has a wonderful voice. Okay, why don't we hear some more from Joanne?
Awesome. I'm just going to
lubricate.
These are longer readings than I'm used to, but so I was going to jump ahead, but I thought, you know what, let's just go to chapter 2 and continue on with where I started. So this is chapter 2. After I got home and put my paper away, I hurried next door. I'd worked at the funeral home on Sundays and after school sometimes, but now that school's out, I'm there pretty much every day. That's worked out great for my parents, since the assistant funeral director, Danielle, takes the summers off to travel with her husband and kids. They travel around the country in an RV, going from campground to campground. Mom and Dad still have another staff member, Sid, but they had planned to hire a summer student too. Then I came up with the perfect plan to avoid going back to camp, and now I'm their summer student. When there isn't a funeral going on, my job is mainly to make sure everything's clean and check that we have enough supplies. When there is a funeral, I direct people coming into the chapel. My older brother, Nate, is in charge of traffic outside, then hands out kippas to the men who need to cover their heads. I hand out the printed programs and packets of tissues. It doesn't seem like much, but when nearly everyone around you is crying or is about to start crying, it's important to make sure everyone has enough tissues. Dad always says that people shouldn't have to worry about little details at times like these. It's our job to take care of those little details. My first task on this day was restocking the fridge in the quiet room with bottles of water. There had been a funeral the day before, and it had been scorching hot outside. People must have been really thirsty because the fridge was nearly empty and the recycle bin was filled with empties. I was kneeling on the carpet, humming to myself as I stacked the shelves, thinking about how I'd better get out the vacuum next. Even if the carpet doesn't look dirty, Mom says it always needs a daily going over. I startled when I heard a noise behind me. My mother's was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. She was wearing a charcoal gray jacket and matching skirt with a crisp white blouse underneath. Her pretty burgundy and gray scarf was tied around her neck. Her hair and makeup were perfect. I knew what that meant. A family was coming in to arrange a funeral. Dad sometimes meets with families, but usually it's Mom's job. What time are they coming? I asked. Mom glanced up at the old wooden clock on the wall. Your dad just left for the hospital. The family will be here in about an hour and a half. I nodded. Okay, I'm just going to finish this and then I'll get out of here. When families come to arrange a service, I'm supposed to stay out of the way. Even though I find all the details interesting, I know it's a really difficult time for the people who have lost a loved one. My parents have to gently guide them in making all kinds of decisions and sometimes explain some of the important Jewish rituals that need to be followed during a funeral. Actually, Evelyn, Mom said, sitting down on one of the sofas, the family, well, honey, this is a tough one. She sighed and looked up at the picture hanging on the wall. It's a photo of a group of rabbis at the Western Wall in Israel, which my dad took when he traveled there as a teenager. I don't think Mom was actually looking at it, though. She seemed a little spaced out. Finally, she spoke again. The family was in a very bad car accident. Both of the parents were killed, but their son, their only child, well, he survived, thank God. Oh, I said, my shoulders slumping. That's really sad. My mom looked very upset. While she and Dad are always kind and respectful of the families that come to see them, most of the time they don't get emotional. After all, people dying is part of their jobs. They're used to it, but sometimes it gets to them, like now. It is, Mom nodded, her voice catching. Really sad. The boy is your age, Evie. He was pretty banged up. Oh, I said again, my heart thumping hard. I didn't like thinking about kids my age getting injured, or sick either, but I pushed that thought away. Is it really bad? Pretty bad, she said, but not life-threatening. Some severe bruising and broken bones, I think. I shivered, and not just because of the air conditioning. Just because I was all around death all the time, too, didn't mean I was okay with it. Losing both of your parents? The worst. I had to push that thought away. Some things were just too horrible to think about. Anyway, Evie, Mom let out another sigh. I was hoping, I know it's a lot to ask. What can I do? She gave me a little smile. I was hoping you'd say that. The deceased woman's brother is coming in to make the arrangements. The son, his name is Oren, will be with him. I was hoping you wouldn't mind spending some time with him while your father and I meet with his uncle. Really? She wanted me to help meet with a family? Just the son, but still. My very first family meeting. I nodded, trying not to smile because you're not supposed to be happy about talking to someone about their family members dying. But I couldn't help being a little excited on the inside. It felt like I'd just been promoted from cleaner and tissue girl to junior funeral director. Okay, I said, already thinking of what I would say to him. I could explain the funeral process and help him learn the special prayers and give him the black ribbon he'd have to tear to put on his clothes. And my mind whirled. I didn't even realize Mom was still talking. You can stay with him in here while we meet with his uncle in the office. If he has any questions or wants to be involved in any way, we'll honor that, of course, she said. But I imagine he'll be more comfortable in here where it's quiet and with someone his own age. She gave me a smile, and I bet you can answer just about any question he might have. I smiled back at her. That's true. I did know a lot about funerals. I might not be allowed to do stuff, but that didn't mean I couldn't prepare for the day when I would start working as a real funeral director. I couldn't wait to really help people and do something, not just sit back and watch. Yes, tissues were important, but I could do more. I wanted so badly to do more. Thank you, Evie, Mom said. That will be really helpful. Of course, I said, closing up the little fridge and standing up. I brushed some dust off my shorts. I'll do a quick vacuum first, and then I'll go get changed. Mom got up off the couch and sighed again. I feel so terrible for this boy. One day all is well, and the next, his entire life has changed. She reached up and adjusted the picture, even though it wasn't crooked. I'm sure he could use a friend more than anything else right now. Okay, I said, because it was the answer Mom expected. But I had no intention of being this boy's friend. Nope, never again. What had happened to him was awful. Of course I'd help him. Being a funeral director, even a junior one, meant I would always help out someone who was grieving. But that was it, no more. Mom gave me one of her looks. Evie, I know I don't need to remind you to be respectful, kind, and on your best behavior, right? I rolled my eyes. You mean like you just did? Mom smirked. Right. And maybe, she paused for so long that I had to say, maybe what? Well, maybe don't talk his ear off? I lifted an eyebrow. She lifted one of hers back at me. Fine, I said with a sigh, because, okay, yes, in my family, I'm sort of known as a talker, a big talker, like a nonstop talker. Out of nowhere, Mom grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me into a bear hug. Urgh, I gurgled when she squeezed me really tight. Mom! Shush, indulge your mother. Another thing about being the daughter of funeral directors, you get used to a lot of random and spontaneous hugs. Chapter 2.
Ugh, doesn't that just make you want to just curl up on a couch and read the rest right now? Okay, I have some questions for you, but I do want to get to some of the great questions in the Q&A. So I think a good segue from what you read is to Karen Beer's question. Do you see this as a book read by a parent and child together so that they could discuss it further?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think this is a great book for kids to start questions and for parents to sort of address themes of grieving and funerals and make it be meaningful discussions. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of kids out there for whom this book is a bit too much and might be a difficult read. But I do hope that it sparks lots of questions that kids can take to their parents and talk about. Thank you.
And I just to go on to the next question, which I think is connected. Jay Anderson Coates asks, who do you hope picks up this book? Like, who is your ideal reader for Sorry for Your Loss?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I want to say everybody is my ideal reader. You hope that kids and adults get from your book what they need from it, what they want from it. I think there's a lot of different themes that will appeal to readers. I mean, there's the friendships, there's the bullying, there's what happens behind the scenes at funerals and grief, and there's a lot there. So my ideal reader is anybody who wants to sit down with a book for a few hours. I know that seems like a very trite answer, but
I think that this is obviously a great book for kids to read, but I also think parents can learn a lot, adults can learn a lot from reading this book about how to normalize talking about death to kids and giving them words. Because I think often as parents, we know that these conversations would be good to have, but we don't have the words. And I think this could be really instructive for adults and teachers as well as for kids to read themselves.
Thank you. And thank you for saying that. And also, I think Evie doesn't model the best way at the beginning of how to deal with somebody who's grieving. And she doesn't realize that it's not about her. And she might know that intellectually, but there are a few times where she inserts herself in and is frustrated that she's not getting what she needs from Oren, where he's the one who's suffering. So I think that it was important to me to model sort of that behavior of be what that person needs, not what you need. And I know that talking to grieving people can be awkward and difficult, but hopefully kids will get from that, just to be there and see what the person needs. So yeah, trying to model that sort of how to deal with grieving people in a way that's sensitive and you're not going to make it worse. At one point in the book, Evie says, I made it worse, but how could you make it worse that this boy lost both his parents? But anyway, that's her struggle with dealing with somebody else who's grieving. Yeah,
I think it gives the wonderful message of, I like to say, don't just do something, sit there.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just need somebody by your side.
Yeah, exactly. And at one point in the book, Evie even recognizes that the hardest thing that she could do was just to be quiet and sit there. And that's what she does. And that's where you see, spoiler alert, her growth through the process of dealing with Oren and his grief.
Yeah. So one of the questions I have, I'm going to incorporate into a question from Carol, that most of your books take place in Jewish settings or have Jewish characters. In Sorry for Your Loss, Carol says, it's unusual to see a whole Jewish world with almost all Jewish characters in a contemporary setting. Was that a conscious decision? And did you not specify a denomination like conservative or reform or Orthodox in order to be more inclusive?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, the setting of the funeral home that I am familiar with is obviously a Jewish funeral home. So that sort of informed that there. Most of my recent books have Jewish characters. If they're not super Jewish in content, they still have Jewish characters. And that is a conscious choice. I'm Jewish. I recognize being Jewish. And, with anti-Semitism on the rise, I want to normalize that there are Jewish kids out there who are just like non-Jewish kids. And we're all the same inside. So it's important to me to build empathy, and kids who will read the book who may not be Jewish. I want them to still see themselves in many ways, even if they're not Jewish. So yeah, it was a very conscious choice. But as I said, the funeral home sort of instructed that this would be a book about Jewish practices and rituals and traditions. As far as denomination, my dad's funeral home is, I guess it would be non-denominational. It serves everybody in the town regardless. And I saw it as that. And I didn't want to be, I didn't want to follow a track of one way or the other. I just wanted it to be very inclusive of everybody, as my dad's funeral home is. So that was a very conscious choice as well. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm just answering Sarah's question. The book is available as an ebook, as far as I can tell, looking quickly online.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
That's a quick and easy one. Anne Dublin has a great question. How did you decide on this very effective title? And did it come to you right away, or was it one of many that you went through?
It didn't even come to me. I am not responsible for this title. So when I was first writing it, it was called The Funeral Book. In my computer, it will be forever known as The Funeral Book. But then when I came up with the title, it was called Tree of Life. And I came up with that title partially because the Tree of Life Synagogue down in the States is a sort of an homage to what happened there. And also because there's so many trees in the book. If you haven't read it, there is like a Tree of Life motif, and the kids do their quilling project and tree, and Oren's name means tree. So trees were very meaningful. But as often happens with titles, when you're dealing with a publisher, not everybody loves the title. And I don't remember who didn't love the title. But they came to me and they said, we need to find a new title. And, I sat on it for a while, and actually Olivia at Orca Book Publishers came up with Sorry for Your Loss, and my editor Tanya and I knew it was perfect. So yay, Olivia, nice job.
It really is perfect. And you still, the cover, this is very evocative to me as a Tree of Life motif. And I love the back with the roots.
Yeah.
It evokes, the organicness of death, that we decompose and we become part of the earth, and we, are born again as flowers and trees and so I think it's a perfect combination. You get that spot on title and you still have that tree.
Yeah. And you know what it's about right from the title. I mean, it's a book about death, right, somehow. Yeah.
Right. And sure. I think that's important. You need to prepare the reader a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so this combines my question with a question that was submitted before. You have had a super busy publishing year with 3 books coming out in the past 13 months. Sorry for Your Loss, The Sun Will Come Out, and Fish Out of Water. What has that been like for you? And I personally want to know if you sleep.
Not last night. Yeah, it's one of those things that, I mean, it's been an amazing 13 months. It's been so busy and kind of overwhelming, but it's been the culmination of years of work where everything just sort of came together all at once. So for example, The Sun Will Come Out. So that was my summer camp book that came out in April. I think I started writing that in 2013. So a while back, and Sorry for Your Loss is, I think, about 4 years in the making. And Fish Out of Water was one of those like very quick books that happened right away. So it's, you know, it's weird how it all came together in that short span of time. But like I said, it's a culmination of many years of work. Yeah, it's been a weird, busy time. Yeah. But amazing. Like, it's just been so good. But yes, I do sleep.
That's good to know. So just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, stick them in the Q&A. And I'm going to ask another one, which I was thinking of when you talked about Evie and how talkative she is and how she needs to learn how to be quiet. And this may be a little bit of a spoiler, but it becomes apparent quite early in the book. But Oren is mute. He stopped talking after this traumatic accident. And I'm very curious about that decision and the challenge of writing a character who's not speaking out loud.
Yeah, I can't remember the conscious decision of making him selectively mute. I mean, he can speak, he chooses not to, and it's revealed in the book. But it seemed like it was a great foil for her, because she wanted so badly to talk with him and to get him to talk out his feelings, because that's what she does. She talks. So it was a big frustration for her that he didn't talk. And it was a challenge. It got to where I, as a writer and reader of my own work, because I'm my own first reader, I started getting annoyed, trying to figure out what he was trying to say. And then I inserted texts into it. So that sort of made it a little easier that they texted back and forth, or she spoke and he texted. And then when it got to where I just couldn't take it anymore, that he wasn't speaking, that's when the big moment came, that the big reveal of why he's not speaking and what happened. So it's funny. I don't know if readers would get that in reading, but it gets to where I, as a reader, I'm like, I can't stand anymore that he doesn't speak. And then he speaks. So it's almost like I was my own beta reader for that particular thing. But it was a challenge. It's a challenge writing a kid who doesn't speak along with a kid who speaks a lot without it getting obnoxious.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, that was a great decision. There's one question here. I'm not so sure it's for you, but it's a curious question, and about why Sarah Hart Snowball wonders why and how people choose this profession, and is it usually a means of following a family tradition? I mean, I know you've told me that your father came into this work late, so it wasn't a family business for him.
But I think that my dad's family was involved in the Hever Kadisha earlier on, and I think that's how he got into it. I don't know if Dad's typing into the chat, but I think that's how it happened. So I think that there is family traditions of volunteering for that part. And I don't know, I get the sense that funeral businesses tend to be a lot of family businesses. I'm not really the right person to ask because I'm not in the business.
Yeah.
But I think it is family traditions. I mean, I think that you see how important the job is and the role, and yeah, the respect and how people are cared for and how important it is. So
Yeah.
I think it's probably common to be a family business.
So we're going to wrap up in about 8 or 9 minutes. So if you have more questions, plop them down into that chat. Is there anything that you wish I had asked you, or that you've always wanted to talk about and nobody thinks to ask you?
It's been such a whirlwind since the book came out just a few days ago, last week. So people have asked me so much, and the questions have been amazing. But as a writer, I had one person ask me if I was going to write a sequel. And at this time, unless somebody from my publisher wants to call and ask me to write a sequel, and I know my agent's here, so maybe she could facilitate that. But as it stands right now, no. I think Evie and Oren's story as it is done. But at the same time, I have this little fantasy that they grow up, they run the funeral home together, and they get married and happily ever after. So in my head, there is a sequel, but I probably won't write it. But I love these characters and I love them together. And I think that they would make a great team running a funeral home for sure.
I totally recognize that feeling of not wanting to let your characters go. You spend, years with them, and then, it's time to put them to bed and send them out in the world.
Yeah. I mean, it's your job to make them as real as possible. So it's hard to say goodbye sometimes.
Yeah. You forget that they're not actually real people.
Yeah.
Naomi Danis wants to know what new projects you are working on that you're allowed to tell us about.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. So my next book it's also from Orca Book Publishers. And it is another of their current series, which is one of the shorter books for striving readers, similar to Fish Out of Water. And it's called The Book of Elsie. And it will be out, I think it's August 22nd of 2022. So less than a year again. And it's about a girl who wants to save her synagogue's Purim party, and in the end, save her synagogue from financial straits. And I was telling somebody the other day, it's got one of the funniest scenes I think I've ever written. I hope everybody else thinks so, but it's one of those things that I wrote it and I laughed, and that's always a good sign. But it also contains some serious subjects, anti-Semitism, and as much as you can pack in a 17,000 word book, I have packed in there. So The Book of Elsie.
The Book of Elsie. All right. Looking forward to that one.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's sneak in one last one here. Children helping other children with their grief is very powerful. How did you come up with that?
Well, that seems like a complicated question. I write books for kids about kids interacting with other kids. So I guess it's kind of a natural progression of, where I wanted to set the book. And tweens aren't going to read a book about adult funeral directors and be able to relate to it. So I had to insert a kid in there. And I thought it would be interesting to have a kid who grows up in the business and assumes she knows everything just by nature of being inserted in it, but really doesn't know that much. So her growth, her story arc grows along with how she helps Oren with his grief. So kind of out of necessity to be able to write a tween book about tweens, she needed to help him more than showing him in therapy or working out his own stuff with adults. So that's pretty much where that came from.
Huh. All right. Last chance. Let's see. I think we got given them all they want.
All the questions. Yes.
I'm sure there's wonderful comments in the chat. Oh, wait, something popped up. Let's see here.
Yeah. So my dad says our family has been part of the Hever Kadisha for 90 years, starting with Joanne's great great grandmother. So definitely a family business that I didn't know much about when I was a kid. I think it wasn't really talked about. But yeah, I remember Aunt Esther was involved in it. That I do remember, my great Aunt Esther. So yeah, thank you for clarifying, Dad.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see these various Jewish traditions in a book, and in a book that's not published by a Jewish publisher.
Yeah, and before we go, I just want to sort of add on to that it was so important to me to write this book for a mainstream publisher that would get out to all kids, Jews, non-Jews alike, because I think that's how we build empathy in our kids, is having them read about people like them and people not like them. So it is my hope that kids everywhere read this book and identify with it, and maybe learn something about themselves and other people that they enjoy and learn a little from. So that was really, really important to me. So thank you for bringing
windows and mirrors.
Yes, exactly. The windows and mirrors thing. Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been so much fun. And I'm glad to be part of getting the world to know more about this book. So thank you for
and go out and get Zippy's book too, which is amazing. Thank you, Zippy, for hosting and being a wonderful wrangler of questions and asking me such awesome things. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you everybody for attending. And I will be sending out an email with the replay. So if you were just so riveted that you want to watch this again, you will be able to, and I will send it out probably tomorrow as soon as I get it loaded up on YouTube. So thank you so much everybody for attending, and thank you Tzipi for hosting, and yay.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. Take care everybody. Enjoy your Wednesday.